Um, it is quite clear that climate change is an existential issue for us in the region, and I understand that we're talking to journalists and media personnel, and I think part of what I have to share is there's a clear disconnect between the messaging from our political leaders as it relates to this existential issue and the sentiments and knowledge and attitudes on the ground from our population. So I have really 4 areas I will discuss. If you could go to the next slide, Brandon, is just a quick mandate and role of the 5 Cs, because I want all the media personalities and journalists to understand that the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center is in fact a resource that is there to support you and in terms of providing both technical and scientific information regarding the impact of climate change on the region. So, and then I'll sort of 4 high-level takeaways from the AR6 report that have direct implications for the region. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we decide on the regional climate change priorities. And then lastly, which in my view is the most important part, is the role that you play, the media, in shaping knowledge, attitudes, and practices at all levels, at the political level, at the civil society, at the community level. Next slide. By the way, just before you move, Brandon, these 2 pictures here, one of them is a village in Belize, in the southern part of Belize, that I took about 6 years ago. This is a cemetery that you see that is being washed away by the sea, the rising sea. And I think one of the key parts of the media is to draw attention to the losses and damages that are happening. And you could imagine what it means to the families whose loved ones are buried in this cemetery, that perhaps in the next couple of years is going to be completely swallowed by the sea. And then while that's despair, the picture below is one of a mangrove restoration that is happening to help with the erosion in some of our countries. Next slide. So the 5 Cs, just very quickly, we were set up in 2004 by the heads of government to coordinate the Caribbean's response to climate change. And we've been doing that through 3 main core services. The first is that we spend a lot of effort and time and money building the climate information and data architecture across the region. So we've installed automatic weather stations, over 200 of them across CARICOM, coral reef early warning systems. We have a whole set of tools that we assist governments and policymakers to incorporate climate risk into development. We are an accredited entity to climate funds like the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund, and we implement projects on behalf of donors and governments. We've mobilized and invested over $300 million over the last 15 years in helping to build climate resilience across the Caribbean. And third, which is related to this topic that I'm talking about, is that the center is the technical secretariat for climate change. So we bring all of the climate change negotiators together. Rona is one of them, and because we have very few negotiators at each individual country, what we do is that we pool the resources across the region and we bring all of the negotiators together, and then we bring together the policymakers and the ministers of environment and climate change across the region, and together we would then shape the priorities for CARICOM, and those priorities are then taken by our negotiators who negotiate as part of the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, and that's how you get into the negotiations that Rana would have mentioned. So, for example, in Jamaica, we would have a negotiator who covers loss and damage, and that negotiator would serve as the CARICOM negotiator for loss and damage, and that negotiator would then brief policymakers and ministers at the ministerial level, and then these priorities would find their way into the political declarations that are made by ministers by the COTED and even by the heads of CARICOM governments. So every year we bring these persons together, and while we're at the COP, we have a pavilion that we also bring negotiators and policymakers and ministers together in real time as the negotiations are happening, so that the negotiators can get their political directives or mandates from the ministers in the event that they require that guidance while the climate negotiations are happening. Next slide. So these are the four high-level takeaways that we believe from the region that has direct implications. One is that, as Juana had said, the impacts of climate change is not some future event. This is actually happening as we speak. It is not only in the Caribbean, all over the world. And in fact, what the AR6 report is saying is that, look, it's a lot worse than we thought, and future impacts will continue to increase with every degree of warming. So you've heard about 1.1 degrees Celsius, which is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And you've heard about the 1.5 to stay alive, and why is it that we have to try to collectively, globally, keep temperatures below 1.5. And I think we've struggled as a society, including in the media, to communicate this concept of 1.5 degrees Celsius in a way that our population understands. And I think one of the best ways, in fact, just yesterday, Prime Minister Motley was saying at a meeting that I'm actually attending, this 1.5 degrees Celsius, one, in the region, we generally don't deal in Celsius, we deal in Fahrenheit. And two, we are used to having temperatures go vast variations, even within a day and a night. But 1.5 for the whole world translates to 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you were to liken that to, say, your normal body temperature, that is at 98.6 degrees, and that's Fahrenheit, and you add 2.7 degrees to that, then all of a sudden you have a fever, right? You have a temperature of over 101 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is a problem. So part of what we're saying here is that as the temperature of the entire world starts to increase and approaches 1.5 degrees or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, the issues that we're currently seeing and that are impacting our states are only going to get worse. Wildfires, sea level rise, stronger hurricanes, increased droughts, more floods, more heat waves. All of these things are going to get significantly greater, including we're looking at approximately 70 to 90% of our coral reefs will be threatened. So if you think of what that means for fishing and for livelihoods and for the tourism industry, you start to get a sense of how existential these impacts are going to be. So that's the first point. This is happening. We know it, we feel it, we see it. Even though our people may not link what we're seeing and what we're feeling to climate change, it is unequivocal that these impacts are already happening, and they will continue to happen unless we do significant curtailment of the greenhouse gases that are going into the atmosphere. The second message I think that comes out of the AR6 report is, while there's a lot of despair, and as the UN Secretary General would have said, it's an atlas of human suffering, there is still hope. There's a very small window of opportunity that we can pursue at the level of the entire world to be able to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees. And the report would have laid out a whole set of actions that were both feasible and realistic if the world was to muster the political will and the financing that is required to get these things done. Move to renewable energy. We need to decarbonize electricity and move to electric vehicles and those kinds of things. I'm not going to go into the specifics of those. I think those are in the report. So the important thing here is that there is a window, but the window is closing fast, and we have to cut emissions by about 43% by 2030. And we have to peak emissions by 2025. So that's just a few years from now. Unless we do this, we're almost virtually certain that by 2040, we would have overreached the 1.5 degrees Celsius or the 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, that when we all have a fever. And that fever, as I said, is going to unleash even more climate impacts on our region. The third point that I think is directly related to our existence and our lives and experience in the region is that there are some impacts from climate change that are already too severe for us to adapt to. And as a result of that, the damages from climate change are going to become even greater. I showed you a picture of the cemetery that is being washed away by the sea. Coral reefs are dying. Countries are losing coastlines to floods. And already they have surpassed their ability to adapt. There are countries in some parts of the world, entire countries, that are in danger of being flooded completely, and people are migrating already. We are suffering a lot of this in the region. There are ample examples across CARICOM where in some localities, we have already passed the point of adapting to the effects of climate change. And then the fourth point is absolutely, I think, critical for us, is that adaptation is crucial. There are feasible solutions that exist. Many of them have been deployed in the CARICOM region. There are others in other parts of the world. But the problem has always been that there is not enough money. There is not enough money in the global climate finance architecture that is flowing from those who are causing this problem to the developing countries and small island developing states that are on the front line of the climate crisis. The fiscal space of our governments are such that they cannot afford the resources required to implement their adaptation plans. And the Paris Agreement had promised that they would provide $100 billion per year by 2020 to help countries meet these adaptation needs. That has not happened, and only about 20% of climate finance is earmarked for adaptation that is coming to the region. So for us, climate finance is always too little, too slow, and it doesn't have the kind of transformational impact on the ground. And as a result, the region is always pressing for the donors and the funds to simplify their access requirements so they can speed up the flow of climate finance to small island developing states and the most vulnerable people. And so we have to do that this decade. We have to do that this decade so that we can build the resilience of our people on the ground to the effects of climate change. Next slide. And so from our point of view in CARICOM, then what the center does, as I said, the ministers and the negotiators, we would come up with these high-level priorities each year in terms of entering into the negotiations. And I want to say the negotiations are only a means to an end, because at the end of the day, we go there and we advocate for decisions at the global level. But at the end of the day, we have to then implement those decisions on the ground, because we have to use that international global diplomatic modality that Luana would have talked about. That is, it's cumbersome and slow, and it's not perfect, but it's the best option that we have. But the COPs are not the outcome. The COPs are where we go to fight, to ensure that we get out decisions that would be in our interests. And then we have to be equally concerned about how we are then implementing the decisions that come out of those COPs. So for us in the region, we are very adaptation biased. By that I mean, yes, we understand that the developed world have to cut their emissions, because unless we cut back emissions in line with the science, we will never be able to adapt our way out of climate change. And so one of the big ticket items is always that we demand that the G20 and the developed world do more to cut emissions so that we don't get to that 1.5 degree. But because this is a collective issue, CARICOM countries have led from the front by undertaking a number of actions that are also cutting emissions within CARICOM. So even though we have less than 1% of global emissions within CARICOM, we are still doing quite a bit to do our global contribution. The second point there is that climate finance for climate resilient development is always another priority. We our heads of government, our ministers, our negotiators consistently fight for the developed countries to do more to provide climate finance in a quick, efficient, and a scalable manner to help our countries adapt to the increasing impacts of climate change. And as I said, while there is also the similar case that can be made for for finance for mitigation, things like renewable energy, for example, in the region, we have always been focusing significantly on the adaptation finance because we are at the front line of the climate crisis and we need that finance to help our people adapt to the effects of climate change. And then loss and damage obviously is been a long fight. Some of you might have read that CARICOM countries have been fighting this fight for almost 30 years as part of the UNFCCC process, 30 years. And finally last year, we were able to lead through AOSIS to get a decision on the establishment of a loss and damage fund. And this year, as we know, there's a transitional committee that was set up to operationalize the facility. Now, what would be the criteria for this facility? How can we access the resources from this facility in a way that is not going to be bureaucratic and is not going to be difficult? That is the work that we will have to do at the next COP. The next slide. Hello?
Hi, Colin, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Can we get the next slide? Yes, housekeeping came. So the next slide you'll see on your screen, I think is really what I wanted to talk about because of the audience that we're speaking with today. So the 5 Cs would have conducted, through support from the European Union, about 8 knowledge, attitudes, and practices surveys across the CARICOM countries and CARIFORUM countries, including the DR. And what you see on the screen there, I think is quite telling. So when people from across the Caribbean were asked about what is the most important problem facing the country or their countries, look at that red bar. That red bar is global warming and climate change. It was ranked, I think, 8. And you could see people had poverty, crime and violence, unemployment, corruption. All of these things were ranked way before climate change. So these are thousands of people who were interviewed from across countries in a very systematic way. But every time you hear a head of state from CARICOM speak at a meeting at the COP, at the UN, we hear them speak about the existential nature of climate change to our region. We hear about Dominica, about 226% of its GDP wiped out in a couple hours by Maria. And we hear in the Bahamas about the impact of Category 5 hurricanes on our people. We're at the front line of the climate crisis. But somehow, this doesn't trickle down to our citizens on the ground. When you ask them about whether or not they have recognized that it's getting hotter at night and the days are getting hotter, they tell you, yes, we experience some of those things. When you ask the farmers about their productivity on the farm, they tell you Yes, it's not as good as it used to be, and the rains are not coming at the same time that they used to come in the past, but they don't make that link between what is happening to them and their livelihoods with climate change. And this is where I believe that we have a fundamental role. The media has a fundamental role in helping communicate these impacts of climate change to people who are living on the ground in a way that they can start to make the link between their experiences and the effects of climate change. So I think the media has really three important roles to play in this whole dialogue. One, it's about helping us, like entities like the 5Cs, improve the climate literacy and the awareness of climate change and all of the impacts that it has on health, on agriculture, on energy, on diseases, and sarcasm, and all of these things that impact our lives. The second is that you have to also hold our political directorate accountable, in the sense that you can't just talk the talk, you have to also walk that talk, and you may find that sometimes we are pursuing actions that, from a development point of view, that might actually increase our vulnerability and our exposure to the effects of climate change. Things like filling in wetlands and building houses, or not having the right zonation plans, or by taking on actions that, as I said, would cause greater damage when we suffer a disaster. The last point, in terms of the media, is the advocacy, right? The advocacy to help make a clarion call, not just nationally, but also regionally and internationally, about the need for greater global action, the need for political will, and less lip service and more action now. And so we try to bring media personalities to the COP with us so that they can bring that messaging and cover the negotiations happening at the COP. We need to improve the membership and participation of vulnerable groups, indigenous peoples, youths, women, as part of this process. And I think the media has a fundamental role in helping to ensure that this happens. And then also to use examples, powerful examples, and many exist, about how climate change is really impacting our daily lives. There's so many pictures and stories across the region, and equally to showcase the success stories, the solutions that are being implemented within CARICOM. And we have some fantastic examples of really good work that is being done across the region, that is building resilience for people and impacting their lives positively. We need to showcase these stories so that others can implement them in their jurisdictions. Ultimately, then, I think the media has a fundamental role in helping us to shape the knowledge, the attitudes, and the behaviors of our citizens. Next slide. And that's it. So I am happy to take some questions at the end, and I apologize for, I hope the volume was good from my phone.